Guild Wars 2's Mesmer. One of the most unique classes not just in Guild Wars but in MMOs in general. This class finds itself in most endgame content, PvP, world versus world, radiant strikes, fractals, you name it. This class is amazing all round and something I highly recommend. This class builds up clones through weapon skills, utility skills, or even through phantasms, and then we'll spend them for some amazing effects. Now let's have a look why this class is just so amazingly strong, not just in its elite specializations, but even in its core build. Now in endgame, the Mesmer can transition into its elite specializations, and there are two ridiculously strong builds in the Power Virtuoso and the Power Chronomancer. Now what this does is it gives rise to a few different gearing options. Because the Virtuoso gets extra crit chance from Fury, you can build in two different ways. However, I do recommend building the general way, especially while leveling. So I'm going to try give you guidance on what I would consider the 4 best kind of gearing builds. I'll put a link in the description below to them so you can have an idea of how to build. This is the one that I would highly recommend for newer players. This build will turn mostly into the Power Chronomancer build. Now Chronomancer is an incredibly strong build overall, and this is no exception. This does mean that we will use a couple of Berserker's pieces, but predominantly assassins. Most of this will be assassins, and the reason being is we will not use a Sigil of Accuracy like most builds do recommend. Have a look at the gearing combination in the description for an idea, but the goal is pretty much to end up with 75% crit. Now obviously that's not exactly accurate on my build, but it's so close it's barely going to matter. For this build you'll want the Rune of Infiltration. Now this is ridiculously cheap to buy out of the market, or you can craft them yourself. This will give us a lot of power as well as precision, helping us hit that crit cap. So don't forget to put in your runes before you start playing around to get your crit chance. Now for all 4 builds we will use the Relic of the Thief. This will give us an incredible amount of damage as well as being fairly easy to get. All 4 builds will use Sword, and Greatsword, but the sigils will change. For the predominant build that I highly recommend, you'll use the Sigil of Force, which is not too expensive, and then if you can afford it, the Sigil of Impact. Now currently on NA these are going for just over 4 gold, so that is a little bit steep. You can use anything in the interim. You can use, Sigil of Air, Sigil of Hydromancy, anything, and then when you get enough gold, switch over to the Sigil of Impact. Now why this is so good is it gives us the 3% strike flat damage, but also it gives us the 7% on stunned or knocked down foes, which is going to happen a lot out in open world, as well as when you do transition into raids and fractals. Especially in fractals, there is a lot of CC happening, so you get a lot of utility. Obviously for flat raids and strikes, sometimes the Sigil of Air is fairly good, but if you do not want to go around with this, you can use the Sigil of Accuracy. Now what this will do is it will give you 7% extra crit chance, which means you can take more Berserker's pieces to hit your 75% crit chance. Like stated previously, there are basically 4 ways to build. There is the 75% crit chance, which I highly recommend, because that means that even in open world you are crit capping. But if you want to, you can build towards the 60% crit chance, which means that when you do play Power Virtuoso, you will be crit capped. You'll still use the exact same weapons, but instead you will switch out a couple of Assassin's pieces for Berserker's pieces, as well as using Rune of the Scholar. Now this will obviously drop your position substantially, but it will give you a lot more power, which is great for players to do big damage. Now this specific build is still using the Sigil of Impact, which I do highly recommend if you are going to go more into your fractals and open world. But if you want to, there is another build over here that is pretty much the same. Ignore the dagger. I can put a sword in there just to make sure that we are looking like the build that I've recommended. And then what this is using is Force and Accuracy to help us hit that 60%. Now the 4 builds that I will link below will have used the same food. Now obviously you can use a different food with power and precision and then play around with your gear, but I like to build in such a way that I can go for the sweet and spicy butternut squash soup, because then it's just simpler. All my builds use the same food rather than some use in power and precision and some use in power and ferocity. Because when you use a food like the sweet and spicy butternut soup, you're just scaling your damage better. You're not changing your stats, i.e. you're not going to under crit cap if you don't have this food. If people drop foods in raids or strikes or fractals, you can just pick up the food. You don't have to worry about, oh, that's not my food, I can't use that because then I'm not going to be crit capped. Things like that. So that's how I'm building all the builds in the description below. And then for utilities, you can use something like the superior sharpening stones. Obviously, your food and utility, you can use anything. If you want to be more survivable, you can use things with toughness. Now, in terms of extra weapons to consider, if you do have the expansion, you can use the dagger in your main hand. That will give you a bit more range than the sword in the main hand. And yeah, that's fairly good. But having a focus in the offhand is pretty much a non-negotiable in most people's books. Having this allows you to have pretty much the best pull in-game and is highly recommended. Again, also if you do have the expansions, you can always use a shield if you do want to, but pretty much having the sword as well as the greatsword is incredibly strong, and have a focus just in case you are going to do higher tier content like raids and fractals eventually. But we're not really focused on that, we're looking at some strong open world builds. So let's have a look at our traits and specializations. The first specialization we're going to look at is Domination. Minor trait 1, Illusions of Vulnerability. Inflict vulnerability when interrupting a foe, and it's on a 3-second cooldown. Now, vulnerability can be fairly tough to get out in open world, so having this skill will just help you basically peak up your vulnerability, meaning that you're doing more damage to the target. Now in the first column, there are two really strong options for damage. Bountiful Blades basically just makes your greatsword better. What it does is it allows a skill 4 Phantasmal Berserker to do more damage by 33% and allows your skill 2 Mirror Blades to bounce 2 more extra times, making your greatsword incredibly strong. Now, if for some reason you do not use a greatsword, which I highly recommend to use because it is incredibly strong damage, is to look at Empowered Illusions. Empowered Illusions allows your illusions to do 15% more damage. So if you do use a setup where perhaps you're something like sword and focus on the offhand, then I do highly recommend switching to this. But if you are using the greatsword, this is a must. Now the last skill, Rendering Shatters, basically is just going to give us an extra vulnerability on Shatter. Now this doesn't seem worth it in any regard compared to the other options. Minor trait 2, Dazzling. When you daze or stun a foe, you get another 5 stacks of vulnerability, going fairly well with the first minor trait. Now in column 2 we have a fair few good options. The first trait, Shattered Concentration. When we use a shatter skill, we remove a boon. Now this can be absolutely incredibly strong, so definitely something to consider. Egotism, we do 10% more damage when the target we're attacking has less health than us. So this is generally what most people use for good damage, but I would not shy away from Shattered Concentration. And then the final choice, Furious Interruption. Gain quickness when we interrupt a foe. Now if you look, the cooldown and the duration of the quickness are the same, so this is not the worst skill in the world if there is a fight where we are interrupting that often. And don't forget that quickness is an incredibly strong boon to have out in open world. It basically allows us to do crazy amounts of damage. So this is not the worst skill in the world to also consider based on the fight. Minor trait 3, Fragility. We're doing increased damage based on the amount of vulnerability stacks on the target. So this caps out at 25, but if we get all those vulnerability stacks, especially out in open world, this is quite a large amount of damage. And then in column 3, Vicious Expression. And now this is generally what most people will go for. We do increased strike damage to any target that doesn't have boons. As well, when we disable the target, we remove 2 boons from them. This is just incredibly strong damage, and that's why most of the time this is taken. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, basically most setups, whether you're playing Power Chronomancer or Power Virtuoso, this is exactly how your trait tree is going to look because it is incredibly strong damage. But obviously, we have Mental Anguish, Shatter skills doing increased damage as well as extra damage to inactive foes. And also Power Block. Interrupting inflicts weakness and enemies that you have interrupted have increased cooldown. Now this is incredibly strong if you're looking at something like PvP, but in terms of open world, this is not really something you're going to see played very often. The second specialization, Dueling. Minor trait 1, critical infusion. Gain vigor when we get a crit hit, and that's a pretty strong vigor amount because it's 5 seconds with a 10-second cooldown. So we're basically giving ourselves half our vigor uptime just by this trait. Now in column 1 there is one, maybe two good options. Phantasmal Fury, just incredibly strong. Phantasms spawn with Fury 10 seconds, and that is important. We'll get into it in a little bit why it's so good. The second choice, Decoy or Desperate Decoy. When we're hit below 50% health, we'll leave a clone of ourselves and we will gain invisibility. Now this is more of a disengage. You're doing content where maybe you just need to try have some sort of escape plan. This could be considered. And then Duelist Discipline is more of like a Condi kind of build. Minor trait 2, Sharper Images. Illusions give bleeding on crit hits, and that's just some good passive damage. We're never going to say no to damage, even if we are predominantly a power class. Now in column 2 there are a lot of interesting choices, some good survivability options with a Blinding Dissipation. Shatter Skill 2, your F2, creates 3 seconds of blindness. Now this can be quite strong in some instances. Evasive Mirror, when we dodge we can reflect projectiles. Now this can be clutch in some open world events where there are a ton of projectiles, even some raiding encounters. This could be good for survivability. But for DPS, you have this option, Fence's Finesse, an incredibly strong skill. When you're striking with a one-handed sword or spear, you gain a stack of Fence's Finesse, which lasts 6 seconds. Now you can stack this up to 10 stacks, meaning you can get 150 Veracity at level 80, making this an incredibly strong skill for DPS. That's one of the reasons why you can't just camp Greatsword, but you've got to come back to your sword part of your rotation to try and stack this buff up so that you can do some massive damage. As well, sword skills and spear skills gain 20% reduced recharge, making this again an incredible trait to have. So you've got an incredible DPS trait as well as 2 fairly good survivability traits. Minor trait 3, Master Fencer. When we crit strike, we give not just Fury to ourselves but to our entire party, making this an incredibly strong minor trait. Even though it's only 4 seconds of Fury with an 8-second cooldown, we're giving half the entire party's Fury uptime, meaning that the supports don't have to worry about certain parts of their rotation to try and cap up Fury. We're pretty much doing this as a pure DPS class, but even in the open world, having this much Fury uptime is incredibly strong. Now column 3 is incredibly fun to play around with. Superiority Complex is just straight damage, amazing stuff. Our crits deal increased damage 15%, but a further 10% if the target is disabled or if they're below 50% health. Now that is just incredibly strong tail end damage as well as just good damage overall. So this is just a massive good damage trait. And then Deceptive Evasion. When we dodge roll, we leave a clone. And now this can be fairly good for some massive clone generation, but obviously we're going to need a ton of vigor uptime to make sure we've got all those dodges. And again, I'm not going to lie to you, for Power Chronomancer and Power Virtuoso, this is pretty much how your trait's going to look. So this is incredibly damage focused so far, but with this comes great utility. And now for our final specialization, Illusions. Your minor trait 1, Cry of Pain, basically gives us an extra stack of confusion and it increases the duration of confusion. Now that's just free DPS, so we're not going to complain too much. Now in column 1 there are 2 incredibly strong choices. The first option, Shatterstorm, where your F1 shatter skill basically becomes an ammo skill, so it will have 2 charges. Now when you do kind of structured gameplay where there are boon givers, this can be fairly strong because the F1 is probably one of your strongest hitting shatter skills. So this means that you're going to get some great damage out of it. But Persistence of Memory is amazing for open world. When your Phantasm becomes a clone, it will transfer its boons to you. So let's take a second to talk about Phantasms. Phantasms are based on skills that you will hit. The skill will produce its own effect, but then it will spawn a phantasm, like in this case Sword 5 will spawn a phantasm. It will do its own attack, and if it lands the attack, it will turn into a clone. So what that means is when this phantasm has completed its task, it will become a clone, but then it will transfer all the boons that were on it to you. This is monstrously good because remember, we have taken that our phantasms will have fury, and later on you'll see that your phantasms will have other boons. Now they can gain a lot of boons just by existing and gaining boons passively through other gameplay mechanics, meaning that you're going to get so much utility out of the skill in open world and help you get some great boons even while there is no one around producing it. Minor trait 2, compounding power. Even though illusions is considered a little bit more of a condition damage specialization, we can find some good utility here. When we create an illusion, and an illusion in this case is either a clone or a phantasm, we will basically gain this buff for 8 seconds and we can stack it 5 times. 2% damage and 30 condition damage. Now we don't gain that much utility from condition damage, but we've got a few attacks that will produce bleeds or confusion based on traits that we have taken, making this not the worst thing in the world because damage is damage. So the more damage we can do on open world, the happier we're going to be. Now column 2 seems interesting, but I just think there's only one option. Now the first trait that you could consider is Escape Artist. When a phantasm is created, it is distortion. Now distortion basically means it's immune to like all damage. So basically what this means is your phantasms can't be destroyed. And now that does happen every now and then, but not very often. But the non-negotiable trait in my opinion is Phantasmal Haste. Phantasms when they spawn have quickness as well. You yourself gain quickness when you create a phantasm. Now this is ridiculously strong because quickness out in open world is just so much damage. Now if you can obviously get the phantasm to perform its action very quickly, and with them having quickness, they will do it very quickly. They will transfer the remaining quickness to you with this persistence of memory, making this an incredibly strong trait to use. Minor trait 3, Master of Misdirection. Our shatter skills reduce 15% quicker. Now this is obviously just really good because we do get a lot of utility, even CC, out of these shatter skills. In our column 3, there is 2 fairly good options to have a look at. The first option, Phantasmal Force. This is incredibly strong because what this does is gives a 1% damage for each stack of might. Now obviously might stacks up to 25, meaning this can reach plus 25% damage for our phantasms. As well, we gain 3 stacks of might when our phantasm becomes a clone, so that's a good way to generate might for yourself, so you yourself can do some great damage, but you're also getting that damage on the phantasms themselves. And then the second trait, Master of Fragmentation. What this does is it augments our shatter skill slightly, basically allowing them to gain extra effects like increased crit chance, cripple, AoE stun, as well as a reflect. Now this is also a very strong skill to consider based on the fight. And that's pretty much it when it comes to traits and specializations. Now obviously you can see by the way this is built, it is incredibly damage focused, but the reason being is this class has got amazing burst. When you play this out in open world, you'll be pumping down veterans and elite mobs before they get a chance to do any damage to you. Now obviously if you want to bring survivability, play around with the traits. I went through a few of them that are good alternatives, but even just keeping it like this is just so strong. Now when it comes to my recommendation, it's quite tough. It's a big toss-up between Domination and Dueling in my opinion for the first choice. I sometimes think that Domination is good because I do like the idea of the Boon Rip, as well as all the vulnerability and the effect it has on the Greatsword. I feel like this is just a little bit better than Dueling, although Dueling has got some good vigor as well as some fury applications. But have a look at it and see which one you do prefer. Like I said, it's such a toss-up between these two, really nickel and dime. And then obviously Illusions, when you get to 71, can be your third choice. Illusions is kind of more of a condition line, but with this build you're going to be gaining so many extra boons, especially because of this persistence of memory, making this really strong actually. And now let's have a look at some utilities and skills. For healing skills, pretty much Signet of Ether is your main heal that you want to take. The reason being is that we heal ourselves for a fairly decent amount every time we summon an illusion. So that means that any phantasm or clone skill that we use will proc this and we'll get a small heal out of it. Now this happens fairly often on Greatsword, meaning that we've got a lot of stability in terms of a healing in Greatsword. And when used active, heals us for a large amount and 100% recharges our Phantasm skill, so that we can use the skill again for some DPS. Now that does scare some people to use your heal skill for DPS purposes, but because of the utility of a lot of these skills, that equates to so much DPS. But obviously if you are a newer player and you are too scared to use it for DPS purposes, just allow it to do the passive healing when summoning illusions and then use it when you need to actually heal for a large amount. Another really strong heal is your Mantra of Recovery. When using this, it's a nice party-wide AoE heal that is quite strong when charged, and then you gain 2 charges, allowing you to basically stagger more healing over time. And then also another strong option is Mirror, giving us quite a decent heal with such a short cooldown, as well as Reflect. What's nice about the Mesmer in general is our heals have very short cooldowns, making them really nice to use more often than a lot of other classes. Now most of our utilities we can play around with. I highly recommend Phantasmal Disenchanter as a really strong skill. Obviously this skill does incredible damage without boons, so making sure that you can cast this on a target without boons equates to massive damage, and it also has a very short cooldown. But obviously it is a boon removal itself, so this is also a strong skill to rip boons off of targets if there are too many to take off with your normal skills. This also combos really well with Vicious Expression, equating to extra damage to targets without boons. So having this up is incredibly strong, and also the fact that it has 900 range, making it a really nice strong range skill to use. Also the fact that this skill is a phantasm makes it even stronger, so it still counts as all the effect of illusions and phantasms, making this a ridiculously strong skill. As well, your heal skill will reset Phantasmal Disenchanter because it does reset your phantasm abilities. Now another really strong damaging utility is Mantra of Pain. Now what this does is when you initially charge it will give us 8 stacks of might, and that's party wide. Now obviously the plan is not to have to cast this every time when you're doing content because it is a long charge time, but charging it up before a big fight, or if you see some champion on open world that you want to take down, charging it before to get that 8 stacks of might can be pretty smart. Then once it's active, you want to just use 1 charge of it whenever it is on 2 charges. So you basically want to use it every single time, just keep it on 1 charge. What's really great about this ability is there is no cast time, so you can use this in between auto attacks while casting other abilities. You're getting the extra vulnerability, the damage because this is AoE, as well as obviously the 1200 range on the skill, making it incredibly strong for just general DPS purposes. Now the third utility slot is the one that I recommend playing with. Obviously you can change every single one based on the encounters and the content you're doing. Mirror images that I have on is basically just an instant 2 clones, meaning that I get instant 2 clone illusions up here for my shatters, as well as a stun break. But having a look at some of the other options, there is tons. Just like all classes in Guild Wars, I'm going to point out a few of the ones I really like. Feedback: having a dome that reflects projectiles is fairly strong. Generally this is taken in some encounters, especially in open world, to reflect and protect massive raid groups while doing open world and raid content. Portal, an incredibly strong ability. Even though it has been negatively infected by such a massive cooldown, this ability is so good, allowing you to port around entire groups and parties to do content makes the skill ridiculously strong. Blink is pretty much a skill that most people would use, especially out in open world. Having it as a stun break, as well as just obviously being able to teleport great distances. It's also got a fairly short cooldown, making this quite great to actually have. A highly underrated skill, Arcane Thievery. Because of its incredible range, this skill can be used almost everywhere, and it's got such a short cooldown. we can steal 3 boons from a target as well as transferring 3 conditions from ourselves to the target. We will give it slow if it successfully hits, and we will gain quickness. So yes, an incredibly strong skill, and then probably one of the best utilities, Mimic. Mimic allows you to use another utility except for an elite utility and allow you to use that skill more often. So basically it takes the cooldown from the skill. So if you want to say drop a portal but you don't want to wait another 72 seconds to have your initial portal, you can drop a portal, use Mimic, and then drop down your next portal. Now you'll notice that Mimic has its 20-second cooldown plus the cooldown of portal, but I have portal ready to go again. So I can portal my team over and then use my portal again as soon as it's ready. So Mimic is an incredibly strong skill when you want to basically have 2 of the same skills for different purposes, but really quickly. And now to have a look at some of the other utilities. Mantra's incredibly strong. What most mantras have is they'll have an initial skill when charging up. So in the case of Mantra of Concentration, when charging up we'll gain Aegis and Stability. And then what we'll do is we'll get 2 charges, and that will only produce stability. But notice this is party wide, and that's kind of how mantras work. They've kind of got an initial charge, which is quite a long charge time, like in the case of the Mantra of Resolve, 2.25 second charge time. Now that is quite long, but in that initial charge, I will cleanse 13 conditions on myself and 3 on allies. And then afterwards, when I use the 2 charges, it will cleanse 3 conditions on my party and I'll have those 2 charges. So if I only use one of the charges out of the 2, it will recharge. But if I use both charges, the entire skill will go off cooldown and I'll have to reactivate the skill and wait the 2.25 second charge time. So sometimes it's really nice before a fight, like in the case of Mantra of Pain again, to get that 8 stacks of might before a fight and then obviously go in. So sometimes in the case, if you are going towards maybe a champion on open world, you want to get that Aegis just for the first hit and then just keep the 2 charges for when you actually need them. And then also another great skill set to look at, Signets. Signets have a passive ability that can be just left on to do incredible things, and then an active, like in the certain case of Inspiration, it extends boons, and obviously Signet of Domination, quite a big one because it is a huge Defiance break bar / CC with a 3-second stun. And with a 1200 range, this is taken quite often, even in Raiden and things like this. For DPS, we don't care about that passive, that increased condition damage. We just want that amazing CC. Now for elite utilities, again, we are spoiled for choice. I like to leave on Time Warp because of the super speed and the quickness. Now what this will do is it will create a nice big dome around you that will basically just pulse quickness every second for 5 seconds, as well as slow and chill enemies and grant you some super speed. Now this is incredibly good utility, and this is also party wide. And based on all the other skills that is given as quickness, that's quite a fair amount of quickness for open world. Even for a non-elite class, we're quite gifted in that sense. Now, if you want Omega CC, the Signet of Humility is incredibly strong. Now, its passive reduces the duration of stuns, dazes, fears, etc. But when we use it active, it will transform the target into a Moa bird. But obviously, when it comes to things like champions that have a Defiance bar, this will just do incredibly large CC. And now for our final elite utility, Mass Invisibility. This skill is ridiculously strong. One of the few skills to have stayed 10 targets. This is taken in PvE, Fractals, World vs World, PvP, everything. 6 seconds of invisibility for 10 targets, and it has got a massive range with a fairly short cooldown. Now, if you do find yourself going into chaos, you can take Prismatic Understanding, which will increase the duration to 9 seconds. So if you do want longer invisibility for 10 targets, this is an incredibly good skill to be aware of. Now, I don't want to get into a major rotation concept like I do in my more hardcore guides, but I do want to talk about a few things. In Greatsword, you want to prioritize skills 2, 4, and 3. Those are your biggest hitting skills. Obviously, trying to get in as many Greatsword 4s as possible. Note that your auto attack is a 1200 range, so we can attack from range quite comfortably. So this is basically where you're going to camp when you're scared of a target and you don't want to get close. Now when it comes to sword, you want to try and get as many skills in as possible, because remember, we want to stack some of that fence's finesse. Skill 5, incredibly hard hitting. Skill 3 will create a clone. When we use it again, we will teleport to that clone. So that is incredibly strong. And skill 2 is an evade frame. So when we use this attack, we basically evade damage and we hit like a train. So make sure to use the skill as much as possible. Skill 4 is one of those skills that has two sides to it. If we leave the skill on and fully channel it, if we take one hit, it will activate and basically create an evade with some damage. So we can't block multiple attacks in that 2.5 seconds. We can block one hit and then the skill will activate. But if we quickly use the skill and then push it again, it will basically create the 8 seconds 5 stacks vulnerability and the 2-second daze. So this is an incredible CC skill to use when you need CC. Now when it comes to CC, obviously, like I said, sword 4 incredibly strong. Great sword 5 is a nice knockback skill. So if there is knockback required, use the skill. And then obviously your F3. Now this skill scales based on the amount of clones. So if you need large CC, make sure you have all 3 clones before using it. But even if you activate the skill without clones, it will do some CC. Then in terms of your shatters, obviously you want to use F1 for big damage, F2 for minimal damage, F3 for CC, and F4 to avoid damage. But notice that your F4 is on a very long cooldown. So this is kind of your, I'm about to take a hit that's going to kill me. Let me just use this, get distortion, and try and survive. The more clones you have, the longer the distortion lasts. So don't forget about that. And that's it. That's the guide. I really hope you've enjoyed it. You're not going to find a class like the Mesmer in other MMOs. It is really, really ridiculously fun to play this class. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a like and a subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And if you didn't like the video, thank you so much for watching anyway. Hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.